creates issues right away for the American military because the American military is small. Spain has 200,000 fighting men on the island already, fighting the insurgency there. Now, a lot of them are on their backs due to typhus, malaria, and yellow fever, but they're veterans. They're there. They don't have to be transported. They don't have to be raised. They don't have to be, integrated into the command structure. They're there. The U.S. military at this point, and this is a purely arbitrary Dan Carlin classification, just FYI, but I've always divided the U.S. into 3 or 4, main military eras. And the first military era amongst this arbitrary categorization that I use is the longest lasting one, going from the beginning of the Republic in the 1770s to round about the middle of this war, which will be called the Spanish-American War. One of the features of this old U.S. military is that they wore, I know this is silly, but they wore blue. The traditional American military color is blue, and the U.S. military goes to war in Spain wearing the blue uniforms. Now, the traditional American military is made up of a small core of what are called regulars, the regular army, and that is supplemented by lots of volunteers. Now, the regular army is made up of less than 29,000 men at this point in our history, which, as neoconservative historian Max Boot points out, is less than the number of people who work for the New York Police Department right now. So it's a small force which is meant to be augmented by volunteers. And this is usually not a problem. Americans flock to the colors, as the saying goes, reliably. I mean, the Civil War is the only time we ever had trouble with that, with draft riots and whatnot. And there are a lot of variables that impacted that. Normally, you have more recruits than you can ever integrate in place, and the recruitment offices spring up everywhere. And the way this traditionally works in the American military this time period is if you yourself can raise a military contingent, you can command it. You can be an officer in it. You can be a lieutenant, a captain. If you raise enough people, you can be a lieutenant colonel. You don't have to have any qualifications. It reminds me a lot of the old Roman Republic, where you would recruit these legions once the war started, and you could be a politician, you might be just a rich guy, you might be somebody who just was able to put together a legion. You could be an officer in it, you could command it, and what normally happened is your legion would start off very slapdash and not very experienced and very green, and you would too, but over time you would become integrated and veterans, and then you'd be very formidable indeed. And the U.S. military followed a very similar pattern. I love, though, some of the suggestions that were floated at the time over who should be raised to fight in this war in Spain. The historian G.J.A. O'Toole reprints some ideas that were floated in a couple of the New York papers concerning, who might be raised to go fight the Spanish in Cuba. And again, some of the mental images it conjures up are wonderful. Here's a quote from O'Toole's history. Quote, "Public enthusiasm for the coming war was sweeping the country. The New York World reported that Buffalo Bill Cody had declared that 30,000 Indian fighters could clear the Spanish out of Cuba in 60 days. Frank James, brother of outlaw Jesse James, volunteered to lead a company of cowboys to liberate Cuba. It was said that 600 Sioux Indians were ready to go on the warpath and collect Spanish scalps. And Randolph Hearst's journal proposed a regiment of American athletes who would, quote, overawe any Spanish regiment by their mere appearance, end quote." I'm sorry, but I can't help but think of sending the entire, roster of the teams in the NFL to Cuba to overawe those 140-pound Spaniards weakened by typhus and malaria with, defensive tackles who are used to sacking quarterbacks. It's a fun mental image, but there's a little bit more truth to it than perhaps one would think on the surface. And it's embodied in the volunteer regiment put together by perhaps the most gung-ho person in this whole endeavor. Yes, that's right, Theodore Roosevelt, who had the jump on all the other would-be volunteer regiment organizers because he's been making sure he had all his ducks in a row with the, powers that be to set up this regiment a long time before anybody else knew war was coming. He telegraphed all the powerful people for months saying, don't forget, if a war breaks out, I want to form a regiment, and go. And Roosevelt's regiment, which will become famous in U.S. history, is I mean, if you wanted to look at this from a psychological angle, it takes people who represent both sides of Roosevelt's personality and combines them into one regiment. If the regiment is like an embodiment of Roosevelt's psyche, he's managing to put in the various, sides of it into one group and then integrate them. I know, I'm not much of a psychiatrist, but it's funny because the first group he grabs are people who are like he is in terms of his upbringing and education. Remember, this is a rich kid from the East Coast who went to Harvard and who was, a sports enthusiast. So what does he do? He grabs people from Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, especially if they're, well-known athletes. He likes to get those people who row crew, who play football, who are on the wrestling team from these Ivy League schools, and he grabs a bunch of them to put in his unit. But then he goes to the western, formerly frontier states. Remember Teddy Roosevelt himself as part of making sure he could live this Davy Crockett, Daniel Boone ideal he had of the American past. And he went and worked on these dude ranches in the Dakotas and Montana and places like that. So he went to the American West and grabbed, by his own admission, cowboys and gunfighters and bushwhackers and miners and mountain men and even, yes, Indians, as he called them. And he put all of these people together in a unit that was known as the 1st U.S. Volunteer Cavalry, or as history knows it, the Rough Riders. Now, Roosevelt's group was one of many formed to supplement the regular army, and the first thing that everyone figured out very quickly in this whole affair was that the army was not ready for a war with Spain because they were completely unable to handle the influx of all these fighters. The army couldn't clothe them, they couldn't arm them, they couldn't feed them. There were all these concentration points in the southeast U.S. where these people were supposed to concentrate and muster to move out to Cuba, and the minute these people start showing up, it's a nightmare. Now, contrast the Army's state of readiness with the Navy's, whose conduct, performance, and ability to get off and start fighting instantly was nothing short of exceptional. And Theodore Roosevelt, as Undersecretary of the Navy, probably deserves quite a lot of credit for this. That very same obsession that so many in American politics derided the crank Roosevelt for was paying huge dividends from about the second the war started on, because anybody with a map knew that a war with Spain was going to involve mostly fleet actions, and Roosevelt had the fleet in a state of readiness that is just, well, really, it maybe set the tone for this conflict from the very beginning. All the ships in the fleet were ready with coal supplies. They had full magazines. The advance orders had already been given out a long time ago, maybe illegally, if you believe historians like Immerman. The moment war is declared, telegrams go out to the various commanders of the various fleets. The one received